In 1911, inside a Procter& Gamble laboratory in Cincinnati, Ohio, a team of chemists pumped hydrogen gas through vats of cottonseed oil, a slippery, foul-smelling waste product that southern cotton farms had spent most of the 19th century trying to throw away. What came out the other end was something the world had never tasted before: a snow-white, odorless fat that looked and behaved almost exactly like lard, except it came from a plant instead of a pig. They called it Crisco. Nobody in that lab realized they had just fired the opening shot in a war that would end with butter, lard, and centuries of culinary tradition losing ground in kitchens across the planet. Today, the product of that war sits in almost every home on Earth. The world produces more than 220 million tons of vegetable oil every single year, an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And by volume, it is one of the most consumed food products on the planet. It touches nearly everything: the fries you order, the bread you buy, the soap on your sink, the lipstick in your bag, even the fuel in some cars. But the journey from ancient sacred liquid to a bottle on a supermarket shelf is one of the strangest, most quietly world-changing stories in human history. To understand how we got here, you have to go back almost 6,000 years, long before anyone had a name for chemistry. Archaeologists have found the residue of pressed olives in the coastal village of Kfar Samir, on the shores of what is now Israel, dating back roughly 8,000 years. By around 4000 BCE, communities across the eastern Mediterranean had figured out how to crush olives with stone wheels and press the pulp until a thick, golden liquid ran free. This was not yet food, at least not primarily. It was fuel. Long before anyone poured it into a pan, oil burned in clay lamps and lit the inside of the ancient world. Only later did people realize the same liquid that lit their homes could also nourish their bodies. By 3000 BCE, the Minoans of Crete had turned olive cultivation into an economy. Their palace storerooms held rows of massive clay jars, and their trade ships carried amphorae of oil across the Aegean. When the Greeks inherited this tradition, they elevated it into something closer to religion. Homer called olive oil liquid gold. Athletes rubbed it into their skin before competing at Olympia. A story survived for centuries that the goddess Athena won the naming rights to the city of Athens itself by gifting its people the olive tree. Wealthy and poor alike burned it for light, cooked with it, and used it as medicine. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why oil became more than a food. In the ancient Mediterranean, oil was money. It was traded like currency, taxed by empires, and stored like treasure. The Romans, always efficient conquerors, turned a regional product into an imperial one. They planted olive groves from Spain to North Africa, engineered massive stone presses, and shipped oil in such volume that a hill outside Rome, Monte Testaccio, is still, 2,000 years later, a mountain made almost entirely of broken oil transport jars. Roman soldiers received oil as part of their rations. Bathhouses used it instead of soap, scraping it off the skin along with the day's dirt. In the ruins of Pompeii, sealed the instant Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, archaeologists later found oil still preserved in its container, a nearly 2,000-year-old snapshot of an everyday kitchen. But olive oil only ever grew where olive trees could survive, a narrow Mediterranean climate band. Everywhere else on Earth, other cultures were solving the same problem with whatever grew locally. In West Africa, communities had been pressing oil from the fruit of the oil palm for thousands of years, a fat so central to daily cooking that traces of it have been found in Egyptian tombs dating back 5,000 years, almost certainly carried north along ancient trade routes. In East Asia, sesame oil anchored entire cuisines. In South Asia, mustard seed did the same. Long before anyone spoke of a single global cooking oil, humanity had already invented a dozen regional ones, each shaped by whatever seed, nut, or fruit happened to grow best in that particular corner of the world.
Olive oil's story did not stand still either. During the Middle Ages, as war and instability disrupted much of Europe, olive cultivation survived largely through monasteries, which kept pressing oil for cooking, medicine, and lamp oil for their chapels. In the Islamic world, the tradition thrived even further. The Quran itself praises olive oil as a symbol of light, and merchants carried it along trade routes stretching from Spain to Persia. When the Renaissance arrived, olive oil returned to prestige in Italy and Spain, showing up in the paintings and writings of the era as a marker of Mediterranean identity.
Then, as European ships crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific during the Age of Exploration, they carried olive cuttings with them, planting groves in the Americas and later in Australia, turning a crop once confined to a single sea into one grown on 4 continents. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. For most of human history, oil production was slow, local, and limited by geography. Then, in the 19th century, an industrial accident of American agriculture changed everything. Cotton farming across the American South exploded after the invention of the cotton gin, and with it came an enormous, unwanted byproduct, cottonseed. For decades, mountains of these seeds sat rotting outside gins, occasionally used as cheap fertilizer or animal feed, mostly just considered trash. Then, chemists discovered that cottonseed could be pressed for oil, and that this oil, once refined, was cheap, abundant, and nearly flavorless. By the late 1800s, cottonseed oil was already quietly being blended into lard and even sold as olive oil to unsuspecting customers in Europe. The raw material of the American cotton industry had accidentally become the raw material of the modern edible oil industry. The real breakthrough came from chemistry, not agriculture. Around the turn of the 20th century, scientists perfected a process called hydrogenation, forcing hydrogen gas through liquid oil in the presence of a metal catalyst, which turned a runny, unstable liquid into a firm, shelf-stable solid. Procter & Gamble had originally developed this trick to harden cottonseed oil for soap. Then, in 1911, someone at the company asked an obvious but revolutionary question. If this stuff behaves like lard, why not sell it as food? Crisco went on shelves that year, and P&G ran one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in food history to sell it. Free cookbooks in which every recipe called for Crisco, testimonials from doctors and rabbis praising it as a modern, hygienic, kosher alternative to animal fat, and advertising that quietly trained American consumers to trust a brand rather than question an ingredient. Because it contained no lard or butter, Crisco could be used in any meal without breaking Jewish dietary law, and some of its earliest devoted customers were Orthodox Jewish households, for whom a plant-based, lard-free fat solved a problem centuries old. Here is the part that does not get enough credit. Crisco wasn't just a product. It was the moment industrial food convinced people that processed could mean pure. Hydrogenation solved one problem, but created another. The resulting fat was solid, useful for shortening and frying, but useless for a housewife who simply wanted a clear liquid oil to dress a salad. That gap was closed a few years earlier, in 1899, by a chemist named David Wesson, who developed a deodorization process capable of stripping the strong, unpleasant smell out of raw cottonseed oil. For the first time, a cheap industrial oil could be sold in a clear glass bottle, odorless and nearly flavorless, marketed directly to households as an all-purpose cooking oil rather than hidden inside soap or shortening. Wesson's own name became a household brand, and his refining method is still, in modified form, the basic process behind nearly every bottle of vegetable oil sold today. Once the door was open, other oils rushed through it. Soybean oil, an almost accidental byproduct of America's booming post-war soybean farms, became the country's dominant cooking oil by the middle of the 20th century, prized for being even cheaper than cottonseed. Corn oil and sunflower oil found their own markets. Margarine, built from the same hydrogenation trick, was marketed for decades as a heart-healthy alternative to butter, an irony that would later prove painfully wrong. During both world wars, when butter was rationed and scarce, Margarine and hydrogenated shortenings quietly cemented themselves into everyday cooking, filling a gap that animal fat could no longer fill. Even the crop names kept shifting. In the 1970s, Canadian scientists led by a breeder named Keith Downey spent years crossbreeding rapeseed, a plant whose natural oil was too bitter and too high in a compound linked to heart damage to sell as food, until they produced a variety low enough in that compound to eat safely. The new plant needed a new name, since rapeseed oil was never going to sell in a grocery store. They called it canola, short for Canada Oil Low Acid, and it went on to become one of the most widely planted oil crops in North America. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, a plant most Westerners had never heard of quietly began conquering the world. The oil palm, native to West Africa, produces more oil per acre of land than any other crop on the planet, as much as 10 times more than soybeans. Malaysia and later Indonesia turned enormous stretches of tropical land into palm plantations, and by the early 2000s, palm oil had become the single most consumed vegetable oil on Earth. Today, roughly half of all packaged products on a typical supermarket shelf, soap, shampoo, instant noodles, chocolate, lipstick, ice cream, contain palm oil in some form, almost always listed under a name so generic that most shoppers never notice it at all. Here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Through the 1970s and 80s, American fast food chains fried nearly everything in beef tallow, the same rendered animal fat cooks had relied on for generations, and McDonald's French fries owed much of their signature taste to it. Then, a retired Omaha businessman named Phil Sokoloff, who had survived a heart attack at 43, began pouring his personal fortune into full-page newspaper advertisements, accusing McDonald's and other chains of poisoning America with saturated animal fat. Under mounting public pressure, McDonald's and most of its competitors switched almost overnight to hydrogenated vegetable oil for frying, believing they were making a healthier choice. It would take another 2 decades before scientists fully understood that the trans fats created by that very switch were arguably even more dangerous than the tallow it replaced. And here is the uncomfortable reality that the vegetable oil industry has spent decades trying to avoid talking about. The rise of cheap industrial oil came with 2 dark chapters running in parallel, one chemical and one human. The chemical one took decades to surface. Hydrogenated oils, the very invention that launched the industry, turned out to contain trans fats, molecules that raise bad cholesterol, and were eventually linked to as many as 20,000 preventable heart attacks and deaths every single year in the United States alone. For most of the 20th century, the food industry insisted these oils were not just safe, but healthier than butter and lard. In 1976, when an industry-funded federal review was asked to examine whether hydrogenated soybean oil was dangerous, it concluded there was no evidence of harm. Researchers who challenged that finding, including one scientist who spent literally decades campaigning and eventually suing the FDA to force action, were dismissed or ignored for years. It was not until 2015 that the FDA formally declared partially hydrogenated oils unsafe, and not until 2018, more than 100 years after Crisco first appeared on shelves, that American manufacturers were legally required to stop adding them to new food products. The human one is still unfolding today, mostly on palm plantations in Indonesia and Malaysia, which together supply roughly 90% of the world's palm oil. Indonesia's palm sector alone now employs roughly 8 million people and generates somewhere between 9 and 17% of the country's entire GDP. But investigations by labor organizations and journalists have repeatedly found children as young as 9 working alongside adults on these plantations, hauling 30-pound fruit bunches, spraying pesticides without protective equipment, and missing years of school to help their families meet punishing daily harvest quotas. Estimates suggest over 1 million children were involved in labor of some kind in Indonesia in a single recent year, palm plantations among the most common sites. At the same time, the explosive growth of plantations has driven some of the fastest tropical deforestation on the planet. By some estimates, More than 7 million hectares of rainforest have already been cleared for oil palm, wiping out habitat for orangutans, tigers, and rhinos, and releasing enormous stores of carbon that had been locked in rainforest soil for centuries. Today, the vegetable oil industry has become a genuinely global machine worth several $100 billion a year. Indonesia and Malaysia dominate palm oil. The United States and Brazil dominate soybean oil. Ukraine and Russia have historically dominated sunflower oil, and Mediterranean countries still hold the prestige end of the market with olive oil. Consumer backlash has forced real change. Thousands of companies now advertise products as palm oil free. Certification schemes attempt to track sustainable plantations, and the European Union has passed regulation banning the import of goods linked to recent deforestation. Surveys show the public perception gap is enormous. In one large UK consumer survey, 41% of people called palm oil environmentally unfriendly, compared to just 2% who said the same about olive oil, even though palm oil's extraordinary efficiency, producing far more oil per acre than any rival crop, means that replacing it with something else might actually require clearing even more land elsewhere. At the same time, a very different, very online health debate has emerged around so-called seed oils. In recent years, some wellness influencers and podcasters have claimed that common cooking oils like soybean, corn, and canola are secretly toxic, blaming them for everything from obesity to chronic disease. Most mainstream nutrition scientists dispute the strongest versions of this claim, pointing to decades of research showing these oils, used in moderation and unhydrogenated, are not the villains they're accused of being. Even as nearly everyone agrees that heavily processed food in general, of which these oils are often just one ingredient among many, deserves real scrutiny. The debate has become one of the most contentious food arguments of the decade, playing out less in scientific journals and more across social media feeds. The future of this industry is far less settled than its size might suggest. Olive oil, the oldest player in the story, is now under genuine threat. Prolonged droughts linked to climate change hit Spain, the world's largest producer, so hard in recent years that harvests collapsed and olive oil prices roughly doubled on international markets, turning a Mediterranean staple into a luxury item for some households almost overnight. The same scarcity has fueled a wave of food fraud, with investigators repeatedly uncovering bottles labeled extra virgin that had secretly been cut with cheaper, refined oils. Palm oil faces mounting regulatory pressure and land constraints in the very countries that made it dominant, as governments balance economic dependence against international pressure to slow deforestation. Sunflower oil supply chains were thrown into chaos when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 disrupted exports from one of the world's most important growing regions, sending ripples of shortage and price spikes through kitchens as far away as Southeast Asia and North Africa. Meanwhile, researchers are experimenting with entirely new sources of fat: oil pressed from algae grown in vats, fat cultivated inside bioreactors, even synthetic replacements engineered to mimic the texture of traditional oils without needing a single acre of farmland. Nobody knows yet which of these will matter, or whether the next 100 years of cooking oil will look anything like the last 100. Think about the full arc of this story for a moment. A liquid, first pressed to light lamps in a Bronze Age village, became a sacred substance poured over Olympic athletes, then a currency traded across empires, then a waste product from cotton farming, then a chemically transformed miracle of industrial food, and now one of the most consumed and most quietly controversial substances on the entire planet. Almost nothing else sitting in your kitchen cabinet has traveled that far, through that many hands, carrying that much history in something as ordinary as a plastic bottle. The next time you pour oil into a hot pan, you might think about it a little differently. That thin, golden stream connects you to a Minoan olive press on the island of Crete, a Cincinnati soap factory chasing a cheaper bar of soap, a Canadian plant breeder trying to make rapeseed edible, and a plantation worker on the other side of the world hauling fruit bunches under the equatorial sun, all compressed into one ordinary, unremarkable pour, repeated in kitchens everywhere, several times a day, almost without anyone noticing. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. And drop a comment telling me which part of cooking oil's history surprised you the most.